Stay tuned. Ahead I'll talk with Allan Kozinn about the McCartney Legacy Volume 2, 1974 through 80. The book is filled with exclusive interviews and extensive behind-the-scenes research about Paul McCartney's life and music. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Allan Kozinn was a music critic and cultural reporter for the New York Times from 1977 to 2017, and in that capacity, he interviewed Paul McCartney several times and has written several books about the Beatles. He joins us to discuss the book that he co-authored with Adrian Sinclair, The McCartney Legacy, Volume 2, 1974 through 80. Allan, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
Well, Allan, this is Volume 2 of the McCartney Legacy. And tell us about the time period that this second volume covers.
Okay, so Volume 1 ended with the release of Band on the Run and a couple of incidental things after that. Volume 2 picks up in January 1974. Band on the Run is still climbing the charts. It eventually hit number 1 3 times in the U.S. Because of various singles being taken off and pushing it back up. When we start, Paul is trying to sort of reconstruct Wings because his lead guitarist and drummer quit just before they went to Lagos, Nigeria to record Band on the Run. So he needed a guitarist and drummer. And so he recorded an album with his brother, Mike McGear. Mike McCartney, really, but he used Mike McGear as a stage name. And the album was called McGear. It was all the songs, except one or two really, were written by Mike and Paul together. And the backing band was basically Wings, with Jimmy McCulloch on guitar and a drummer named Jerry Conway. Paul invited both of them to join the band when the sessions were over. Jerry Conway was committed to tour with Cat Stevens, so he couldn't, but Jimmy McCulloch did. From there, we move on to the auditions for a new drummer, and Jeff Britton joins. They go to Nashville to break in 1974, record Junior's Farm and other things. Back to London, start working on Venus and Mars. So through the book, which ends in early 1980, so 74 to 80, he records Venus and Mars, Wings at the Speed of Sound, London Town, Back to the Egg, and also McCartney 2 on his own, although it's not released until 1980. We cover the sessions, which took place in the summer of 79.
This book is exhaustively researched, just like the first one. And you were able to get access to the members of Wings and also a lot of other people who really hadn't talked on the record before about this. So tell us about some of those exclusive interviews and behind-the-scene peeks that you were able to get for this book.
Sure. Jeff Britton, who was the drummer that joined in 74 and really was only briefly a member of Wings, but he hadn't given an interview since 1977 because his experience of being sacked, wasn't something he really wanted to talk about a lot. But he ended up giving us not only like a handful of interviews, but let us use his diaries. And diaries are the best because they help establish a timeline that is inarguable. And on Volume 1, the first drummer, Denny Sywell, let us use his diaries and his wife's diaries. So this thing about drummer and diaries, apparently. Also, producers kept diaries, and when we interviewed engineers and producers, we sort of got them to break into their diaries too. Other people we spoke to, the technical guys at Showco, which was a big, touring enterprise that made stages and sound systems and lighting systems and did the systems for Wings Over America and Wings Over Australia. Big tours that take place in the middle of this volume. All those people hadn't spoken before, and they had incredible, detailed memories of things that went on. So we've got all that in there. David Litchfield, who filmed One Hand Clapping, which was just released this year, 50 years after it was filmed and recorded. He told us a lot, and sadly, he died just before the book came out. Let's see, Stephen Thomas, who was an architect and designer. He basically had designed Wings, Paul's MPL headquarters in London, which is, where his business is based, his publishing company, all that stuff. But then Paul had him come up to Scotland and turn a cow barn into a recording studio so that he could record Mull of Kintyre, because he wanted to record it in Scotland, seeing as about Scotland. And he gave Thomas 1 month to do it, and he managed to do it. So those were all interesting interviews that I've never read any of these people talking before, and they have some great memories. Other people who toured with them, engineers, producers. We tried to get everyone we could who worked with Wings and Paul at the time.
Now, there's so much here that we're going to just scratch the surface to give people a sort of a taste and tease of what they're going to find in this book. But I want to come back to that Scotland studio, because it was interesting. I didn't realize he had recorded in so many sort of exotic places, including at one point on a ship.
Right. He seems to he loves the Abbey Road studios. I mean, that's sort of where he grew up as a musician and where he's recorded an awful lot of his stuff. But he also likes to get away from it now and then. So first there was Lagos, Nigeria for Band on the Run. The idea of recording on a boat actually started when he was producing an album for Denny Lane called Holidays, which is all Buddy Holly covers. And basically Paul played all the instruments and Denny sang, added a guitar line or two during the post-production. But Denny wanted to record that on a boat because he had been to a Rod Stewart session on a boat. And Paul looked into it, and there were just reasons it couldn't happen. But then when it was time to do the next Wings album, Paul sort of revived that idea of recording on a boat. And he got Jeff Emmerich and a team of people from Record Plant in America, and they basically put a studio on a boat, to the chagrin, it turns out, of the captain and owner of the boat, because I guess he thought they were just going to bring on a boombox and record, didn't really realize we're talking about serious equipment. But they worked it out with him, and they recorded most of London Town on a boat in the Virgin Islands. It's kind of weird calling it London Town and recording it on a boat in the Virgin Islands, but that's what they did.
Well, Paul liked to be a trendsetter and to do things differently. But you point out that during this period, he actually kind of was going through some depression, some self-doubt, and in many ways, he wasn't setting the trends during this time period. He was actually kind of chasing those trends to try to, find that next hit.
Yeah, in a certain way. The thing is, his ears and antenna are always up. And he, even during the Beatles years, he and John would go buy the top 10 singles every week and listen to them and, see if there were ideas there that they liked. And if they pinched those ideas, it wasn't always apparent. But Paul did the same as a solo artist. And after all, the times were changing, and the Beatles were no longer the Beatles and no longer the trendsetters at the top. So he had to pay attention. And so he heard, glitter rock, glam rock come, and he didn't quite go that far, but he adopted certain things. You could hear it in Venus and Mars and Rock Show. Let's say, then there was punk rock, which he included, his own versions of it on the Back to the Egg album and songs like Spin It On and Old Siam Sir. And he even enlisted Chris Thomas, who had produced the Sex Pistols album, to produce Back to the Egg. And that's kind of odd, too, because, Chris Thomas famous now for producing the Sex Pistols, but he was a classically trained musician, and worked with the Beatles and did a lot of other stuff. At the same time, electronica was coming about, and so that was sort of what led to McCartney too. He just got all of these synthesizers and keyboards and electronic instruments, and drums and guitars too, and brought them into a studio and decided to just experiment with playing with electronic sounds and things like that. And then even disco, when that was starting, Paul went into the studio again on his own and recorded Good Night Tonight. So, he's chasing trends in a way. But if you think about all of those songs that I mentioned, they're clearly Paul McCartney songs. His thumbprint is all over them. They're in his style, but they embrace punk and disco and electronica and all of that.
Well, as you point out in the book, at this point, it's been a long time since the Beatles, but he still had some interest in collaborating with John. But Yoko would get in the way of that. And he kind of had this on-again, off-again relationship with Yoko. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, the on-again part of his relationship with Yoko was 1974. She turned up in London and visited Paul, and they began talking about John, who was on his, what's now called the Lost Weekend, and he was getting into the papers a lot, and often for, being in trouble, like being thrown out of the Troubadour for heckling the Smothers Brothers, things like that. And so they were talking about, what's going on with John, and Paul asked if she wanted John to get back to her, and she said she did. So he decided to be a go-between, flew to LA, asked John, do you want to get back with Yoko? And if you do, this is what Yoko wants you to do to make that happen. It was a while before it did happen, but that was probably the closest point of Yoko and Paul's relationship. By the end of the book, after they got together again and were raising Sean, Yoko would see that the calls were screened and wouldn't always let Paul through to John. If Paul turned up at the Dakota, he wouldn't be let in. This was according to people who worked for Yoko and John at the time. The one time they got really close, though, to working together in 1975, when Paul was recording Venus and Mars in New Orleans, it wasn't really Yoko that scuttled that. It was more John returning to Yoko. So Yoko was involved in a way, but it wasn't that she stopped him. He actually planned to go. People have asked us, are you sure about that? I mean, May Pang says that they were going to go, his girlfriend, John's girlfriend at the time, to New Orleans, but do we know that John really was going to do that? And we found a letter that John wrote to Derek Taylor, who had worked with the Beatles, and they'd stayed close. And he mentions that he's going to New Orleans to record with the McCartneys. So that was real. And just as he was about to head down there, he decided to return to the Dakota and to Yoko. And that became John's priority rather than going to work with Paul. So he never turned up. I mean, I should say as well that McCartney's manager and all the people around him were dreading the idea of John coming. Possibly partly because they'd been reading about, the Lost Weekend episodes and figured he could, lead Paul astray in terms of, troublemaking. But also, Venus and Mars was a very tightly planned album. Before Paul went into the studio, he knew the running order, he knew the songs, he knew exactly what he wanted. John turning up might have totally scuttled that. It might have been a good thing. Who knows? They might have started working together. And, if you start fantasizing and you go crazy, you think, okay, it's working out. Let's call George and Ringo, but that never happened. Came close, though.
I'm talking with Allan Kozinn about the McCartney Legacy, Volume 2, 1974 through 80. And our conversation continues in a moment. If you're enjoying this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. And thank you. You mentioned the trouble that John got into. It's not like Paul never got into trouble either. I mean, he and Linda had a particular interest in wanting to use marijuana, and occasionally they would take risks, and sometimes they'd get caught.
They got caught several times in this volume, and a few times in the first volume. Um, they were on their 1975-76 world tour. After Australia, they were supposed to go to Japan. They had originally denied Paul's visa because he was busted in Sweden and in Scotland in 1972. But he worked all that out and he was going to go. And then at the last minute, the Japanese government changed their mind. Strangely, given that, when Wings went to Japan in 1980, although everybody warned him, do not bring pot with you, he did. And basically, the book ends with the consequences of that. I argued that we should end it when he gets out of jail in Japan, is on the plane back to England. That seemed like a nice place to end it, and also just let him out of jail. And I mentioned it to Peter Jackson, and Peter Jackson said, "Well, you want a cliffhanger, you leave him in jail." And who are we to argue with an Academy Award-winning director who's giving us a plot point? So we leave him in jail. Volume 3, he'll get out, though.
Earlier you mentioned that Wings tour and how massive it was. At the time, it was the biggest tour and probably the most complicated tour in the music industry at that point. And as you mentioned, you got to talk to the Shoko people. What are some of the things that impressed you about that tour?
Well, the degree to which he had, on one hand, a very regimented set. He played the same set every night, which is, it's one approach to concert giving, thinking of it as almost a theatrical production where you know what you're doing, what audience knows what it's going to get, basically. The alternative is like Jimi Hendrix would go out and every set was different. He'd play 2 sets a night, they'd be different. Paul likes to be more in control. But nevertheless, we found, because I listened to the recordings of every concert, we found that there were certain things he did that changed night after night. Whether he would play a coda on Lady Madonna, how he would introduce certain things like that. But also, talking to the Shoko people, we heard about, just things that went wrong. So for instance, in a few cases, he gets feedback in the middle of a song. And on one of the recordings, you hear him saying, ladies and gentlemen, Morris Litta, which means nothing to anybody, but Morris Litta was the sound engineer. And we spoke to Morris Litta. And so that suddenly made some sense. But there are other times when, for instance, one of the Shoko guys is backstage playing darts with Paul, and the television's on, and Ray Charles comes on TV singing one of Paul's songs. I think it was Eleanor Rigby. And so, he's saying, I'm playing darts with this guy. And then suddenly Ray Charles comes on and sings a song by the guy I'm playing darts with. It just was too much, So a lot of things like that, places where the pyro went wrong in Live and Let Die. These guys remembered everything that happened, every mishap, and everything that worked out well. For instance, when they played in Zagreb, Paul's first time behind the former Iron Curtain. And when he got into the acoustic part of the set and he played Yesterday, the audience sang along completely with the song and, stomping their feet and everything. And it was a reaction that he wasn't used to, because much as everybody loves Yesterday, basically they were sitting there listening to it. But in Zagreb, not quite that way. And he's looking off to the side of the stage to the sound guys. I mean, they told us this, and, he's just stunned. And so he played Yesterday again, which is something he never does. He doesn't do encores in the middle of a set, or repeat things usually. And they sang along again and stomped along again. And that became, in interviews after that show, he would mention Zagreb all the time because of that. So yeah, the tour part was difficult to write because on one hand you've got, okay, he's doing the same thing every night, so we can't have him, now he's in, Cleveland, and they played the show and this is what the review said. That would get awfully boring. But thanks to the Showco guys, thanks to, some other people that we interviewed and things that we found, we were able to sort of keep it from being that, I hope. And the response so far suggests that we managed.
In this book, you give us insights into Paul's personality. And one of the things you notice, he didn't like being told what to do, and he could get stubborn, and sometimes that could get him into trouble.
Well, with Japan, for instance, bringing the pod in was one thing, but he doesn't like to be told what to do. I mean, another example, when they're recording Back to the Egg, Pete Townsend of The Who came into the studio and listened to a bunch of the tracks. And on one of them, he said, what I really like about that is that there's no bass guitar on it. All the bass was in the keyboard. Soon as he left, Paul added a bass. So things like that, sometimes they do get him in trouble. Sometimes it's just, sort of a contrarian approach. But, he likes things his way. He always has, and I suppose always will. And it's just the way it is. Sometimes, he's had some help getting out of some of these scrapes. In one of their marijuana busts, I guess it was, they were pulled over in Los Angeles, and Linda immediately decided to take the rap because as an American citizen, they weren't going to take away her visa. But Paul, because of the 1972 bust, had to work really hard to get a visa for the 76 Wings Over America tour, and even to come back and visit before then. So Linda immediately jumped in and took the rap. So yeah, and there was another one where they were pulled over and the policeman sort of looking in the car in the distance, and he says, "Is that John Lennon sitting in the back seat?" And the person they were talking to was Aubrey Powell, who designed a lot of Paul's album covers with a firm called Hypnosis. He said, "No, well, it's Paul McCartney. If I get you his autograph, will you sort of let us off?" And that worked. So yeah, tons of interesting stories. Another example of him not taking people's advice. He went on vacation to Hawaii when the Japan tour in 1975 was canceled, and the locals told him he liked sort of diving off rocks. There was this big local place where people, dove off sort of a little cliff into the ocean. And they said, don't do it after a storm. And he did it after a storm and he nearly died. He got swept out and he really thought that was the end. But then another wave sort of brought him back in, dumped him on the shore. Very scraped up too, and it was even noted in local papers that he was a bit scraped up because of a swimming accident.
Well, there's so much more in this book that we won't have time to talk about. Now you've written 2 volumes, and taking both of those into consideration, what sort of new appreciation or new understanding of Paul McCartney beyond sort of that public figure that you hope people will take from the books?
I think people will sort of get a better idea of, what it's like to be around him or work with him, and, the ups and downs of that. But for me, really, it's been an exploration of music that I've always known and always, mostly liked. There were some on an album, there might be a tune that immediately grabbed me and loved it from the start. Others I didn't like so much, and some that just sort of washed over me. But now we've been looking at every single one of these songs really closely, following it from the demo to the finished product, listening to outtakes, figuring out, how he wrote it, why he wrote it, what inspired him to write it, and what particular musical innovations are in a particular track. And so a lot of tracks that I hadn't really particularly cared about all that much before I started this have become sort of favorites. And even things like, I never had been a real big fan of Silly Love Songs, but taking that song apart, following it from his, he wrote the lyrics on the back of an envelope with a little schematic of how he wanted it laid out. And then listening, closely, hearing that, he was inspired by Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, which is a totally different song. And yet you look closely at it and it's okay. The vocal counterpoint, which was at a level Paul hadn't worked with before, is something similar to Bohemian Rhapsody. And also the episodic aspect of the song is a little bit like Bohemian Rhapsody. So I can see where the inspiration was and how it came out, but you would never guess that Bohemian Rhapsody was the model. So things like that. And now I have a sort of totally new respect for Silly Love Songs and lots of other tracks.
Well, I have to ask, there's Volume 1, there's Volume 2, which takes us up to 1980. Will there be a Volume 3?
We're hoping so. We're negotiating that with our publisher now, or will be after the new year. And they seem to be open to the idea. When she originally took me to lunch, our editor, Carrie Thornton, she said, "How many volumes do you think it would take to do the whole story?" And I said 5. And the look of horror on her face led me to say, 4. And then we met her again. We had a meeting with her last February, and she said, "So do you think you guys can do 5?" So it looks like 5 might be the way. And if that's the case, Volume 3 will cover all of the 80s. Volume 4 will be the 90s, and Volume 5 will be from 2000 to whenever we finish.
And, of course, at the time of this recording, Paul is still with us. He's still, creating songs, making music, so who knows how many volumes you might eventually end up with.
He's out there touring and he plays a 2.5-hour set every night. And, people have noted, I've noted myself in the past when I've seen him, but people have noted on this tour too, he doesn't even stop to take a drink. A lot of performers have a bottle of water on the stage and have a sip. He doesn't, and he's singing for 2.5 hours straight. So, yeah, I don't know how he does it.
The book is The McCartney Legacy, Volume 2, 1974 through 80, by Allan Kozinn and Adrian Sinclair. Allan, thank you for talking with me today.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Now, if you'd like to purchase The McCartney Legacy, Volume 2, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.